So we are going to be talking about a project that I've been involved in for a little more than a year, building a platform for the state of Georgia to host a whole bunch of websites, from the primary Georgia.gov site all the way through elected officials like the governor or tons of agencies. So they have a lot of sites on this platform, and we've been working with them for about a year to do that. So I'll introduce myself and say that my name is Darren Peterson. I am a technical project manager at Lullabot. This is me. This is not Charlie Parker. I know we look alike. And I've been a back-end developer and team lead and project manager for a good long while now, starting with working in higher ed and then in the private sector, and now working for Lullabot, which is a distributed company of about 50 Drupal developers and designers and content strategists. And we do work for companies who are like big digital publishers, by which we mean their content is their business. So sometimes that means a television channel like Sci-Fi, where they're posting blog posts and episodes and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's a financial company, or as in this case, a state government, where the content they deliver is the thing that that's why they're there, it's what they do. And so they need the kinds of tools that will help them with that. So we have been working with these fine folks. This is the Digital Services Georgia team, and led by, in particular, Nikhil Deshpande, who's the second in the back. He's their sort of chief digital officer and is been working hard for years to advocate for best practices in the state and actually now in other states. So they have a fantastic blog at digitalservices.georgia.gov. Social media accounts, all that kind of stuff. They are totally worth checking out because they've been working really hard for a long time to convince everybody who does state government content, who maybe don't have the skill set or the content experience, to take steps to really be focused on citizen needs and the delivery of those services. So they're a relatively small team in that most of these people are content focused and serving the needs of agencies that they put on their platform. There's only one developer and one designer, and the rest of it is content and service delivery folks. So they have not a lot of development in-house, which means that we get to come alongside and help them. And we really have been partners with them. So I'll set you up the situation. They had a Drupal 7 implementation that was 8 years old. They came from, what was it? Enterprise CMS closed source, which is escaping me right now. It's on the tip of my tongue. It's going to happen as soon as I stop talking. It'll come back to me. Vignette. They came from Vignette. And Nikhil describes this transition from Vignette to Drupal 7 as not so much a migration as an evacuation. They had a short amount of time. Their contract was running out. They had to build this thing fast, and so they didn't get the chance to be really intentional about how their content was going to be represented, and so 8 years ago they got off of Vignette, and here they were in Drupal, and I guess that's just how it's going to be. So they've had 8 years to look at what tools they had to start with and build additional things, and in 8 years that's probably like 3 lifetimes more or less of a website, and you get different editorial paradigms, and you have new needs and new tools that come up, and anytime you've had a CMS for a long period of time, you end up looking something like this, which is to say, one of these things is not like the other, and it's all bolted on and sort of plastered over, and that's what you've got. So this is not my own personal home, but certainly my home improvement projects may look like that. All this is to say that wear and tear happens and iterations happen in CMS. Anybody have a long-standing platform that you're stuck in at the moment that you just feel like this? Okay, so hands, yeah. All right, so when you feel like that, what do? You start by thinking about what you actually want to be able to do and do the research for it. So they had 85 sites that are on this platform, and maybe more than that, maybe closer to 100 since we started working with them. And of those 85 sites, they're varied between tiny, small sites and big sites like the Department of Revenue, tons of documents or just brochureware. But they're all hosted together in a multi-site on the Acquia platform. And they have very different look and feel, very different color palette, branding, all that stuff is all over the map. So that was the thing that they wanted to change, to bring that together. And they have what I would call a sort of a medium governance model, which is to say that if you're familiar with like the case studies around Massachusetts.gov and the replatforming they did into Drupal, they've got a single site where all their state agencies and everything go into one platform. And if you haven't checked them out, they're totally worth checking out. They have a great story about how they've made the product that they've made. So we looked at that a lot in the course of our work. Georgia doesn't have the same mandate that everyone has to be on their platform, so they only can offer in good features to get people on there. So it's all carrot, no stick, as we say. And so that means there are people that are not on their platform, but there's a lot that are, and what they have to do is try and fit their features to the needs of the folks around them and entice them to come into the platform and then get the benefits of unified branding and all the other stuff. As you might expect, they have a ton of PDFs for various sites in various ways, and they care a lot about content best practices and the legal ramifications, obviously, of accessibility, which we all care about. And not just that, but they care about it for the right reasons, which is to say that it's not just because the law says you should do it, it's because it matters to the people that will come to your website. So all of this was in their mind as they started to formulate what they wanted to be able to do. They wanted to take what was essentially a page-driven, WYSIWYG-driven series of sites where everything was just all in the WYSIWYG in the site page content type, and they wanted to turn that into something that was more structured so that they could deliver a vision of a particular service that an agency was offering, like, let's say, how to get a driver's license. They wanted to be able to present that as a structured, this is the service that we offer, here are the related documents, here are the instructional bits of content about how do I access this at the DMV, or how do I sign up online or whatever. They wanted to have all that be structured. And so that was a big piece of how they were thinking about it. They wanted to take contacts, locations, agency and organization information and services, and make sure that they were set up in a way that was standardized across all the platforms so that they could use it and reuse it. And in that same way, they wanted that to be visible on Google so that when someone searches for food stamps in the state of Georgia, they get the agency information in the schema.org cards at the top of a Google search result, locations, hours, all that kind of stuff. They also wanted to be sure editors had an easy time building these pages, even though they were going to be structured differently and built differently. And of course, they wanted their branding not only to be just modern, but they wanted it to begin to enforce some consistency across the platform, despite the fact that they're serving different agencies who all have different needs and could choose to leave the platform if they wanted to. So they needed a new design system that would basically enforce the best practice around visuals, as well as accessibility, as well as all these other things, in a way that editors couldn't sidestep. We didn't want to give editors tools to commit design crimes, and we wanted to be sure that they had enough flexibility to be able to do something distinctive for their agency and yet still be within the design system. So there's a balance point between flexibility and consistency that we really had to hit. And also, the themes needed to be maintainable, because we had, in the Drupal 7 platform, 11 separate sub-themes, and of those sub-themes, they varied wildly in terms of the different ways that color and logos and all kinds of things were used. And also, you couldn't inherit from one parent theme down to a child theme because they had drifted so far apart with customizations and things over time. So being able to have a maintainable, probably single theme was like the desire of their heart, but they hadn't quite envisioned how that would happen. So to jump to the finished product and give you a little piece of this, this is actually Digital Services homepage, constructed to be able to feature various kinds of content, promos. I'll zoom in and give you a little more look at that. But they've got new components that instead of like sliders and carousels and stuff, they've got lists of icons that they can pick the icon and set up the link that it's going to go to. They can describe them. They've got promos, obviously news and automatic lists and stuff like that. We'll talk a little more about how these kinds of pages can be constructed in the system. But from that sort of very brief look at what we were able to build, a couple of key things about the front end before we talk about project management and process is that we had extremely tight pattern lab integration. Many times you might say, oh, we're going to do pattern lab, and that sets up a design system and a set of patterns that are going to be used for the build, but then you copy and paste into the Drupal theme in order to make it work. And what that ends up doing is it causes pattern lab to go stale, and then it never matches up with Drupal after a certain point in time. We actually are using the same templates in our pattern library as we are in the Drupal theme, and it shares all that stuff. So it's super tight integration, and we continue to use Pattern Lab as the place where we prototype our HTML and our CSS, and then inherit that stuff and just make sure that we sling the data properly into those templates in order to integrate them into the Drupal theme. Another key piece of this was flexible typography, responsive typography. You know, if you've ever built a website with you know, a large font at desktop, and then you get down to a small viewport and that font has to snap down to a smaller size. Our implementation uses fancy cutting edge stuff that the font scales with every viewport screen, so it's always the right proportion. It's never like too big at that one last place before the font breaks to a smaller. So this is a really complex, really interesting implementation that's very sort of cutting edge. We worked with Jason Pametal and Mark Drummond in the audience here was our front-end developer to work with this. We believe it's the wave of the future in terms of web typography, and is, as far as we know, we're the largest installation that is using responsive typography on the web right now. And we're happy to be wrong about that, but we're a pretty big installation, and this is the pretty new stuff, and it's pretty great. And then last but not least, we have color palettes that allow us to change color from site to site, all within a single Drupal theme. And those color palette integrations even go down to like SVG icons and reversed out colors and things like that. So that is the designer makes a choice, we build it into the pattern library, we set it up in our color palette system, and then editors just pick what icon they want. Maybe the site has a color palette assigned to it, and they can't make a mistake color-wise. You can't do something that's not accessible, and you can't do something that's ugly. So, for example, 3 different home pages within the system right now. This one's got sort of green with an orange accent. This next one is blue with that sort of green accent. Up at the top with the icon list, you can see the icons are green in the background. And then a third one, which is very sort of red, white, and blue, which a lot of the elected officials like. We call this one Stars and Stripes. Those are all on the same code base, same Drupal theme, same everything. And unlike maybe days in the past in Drupal where you could pick colors with the color module, you can't actually pick individual colors. All you can do is pick a palette and say, hey, there's Stars and Stripes. We're going to click that one, save it, and that's a theme setting. And those swatches and color palette are all selected for you, which means that you can take a single site, make that one switch, and it turns to a different color. Instead of blue and green, now it's green and orange. And they have all these available when they sit down with their agencies and say which color palette suits you the best, but they don't have to do any development to make that happen, and it can't break because it's built into the theme so tightly. So the whole goal of all this design system stuff was that they would give options to people, but not let them decorate the site, basically, so that editors who don't know what good design is and how to deal with CSS could totally have freedom without being afraid to break things. So there's a lot more to the front end. Mark gave a great presentation yesterday of some of the more detailed aspects of that. So by all means, check out his GovCon session link and check out his presentation and his slides that'll be there. But moving on, some back-end achievements. We can publish documents that are related to a node at the same time as the node publishes. So you don't have to juggle, oh, I published my node, but my document didn't get published yet. This was important to them for a lot of reasons, like some like jobs numbers and things like that shouldn't be made public until exactly midnight on a certain day, so that the media and the press can get access to those jobs numbers. Well, all you have to do is publish the node at a certain time in the future, and the document travels with it. And that was not out of the box, and took a bunch of work to sort of figure out. Also, we allow editors to create automatic lists of content like a developer would do with Drupal views, except all they have to do is create a node and set some fields and some configuration, and they've got their basic tools in front of them to create automatic lists as needed, filtered, and it's basically a view wrapped inside a node in a way that makes it possible to sidestep development and give it straight to the editors to do that. which has been a kind of killer app because they can say, oh, I want events for this particular topic, up it goes, and they didn't have to go through the whole sprint and dev cycle and talk about requirements and stuff. All they had to do was just check a couple of boxes and go. We are using Layout Builder, which is new in Drupal 8, which is basically a drag and drop solution, a lot like Panels or Panelizer used to be in Drupal 7, and that has been a huge thing for us, and we customized it further to be able to do things like change the background color on a section or set meta information around the containers that those pages have. And then our micro content that we showed before, like those icon lists and promos and things, can also be used as WYSIWYG embeds. It's the same stuff everywhere. So you can put it in a WYSIWYG and embed it. You can put it on a landing page and drag and drop it. There's a lot of flexibility there. So for example, Layout Builder lets you set up, you start a landing page and you decide that you've got a certain layout you want. You can add a full width section or 2/3 and a third or 3 up. You can populate that with micro content, which is not visible by anybody, but it still has all the fields and things to be structured that you need. Or you can put individual pieces of content on there. Automatic lists, as I've described, all that stuff is all available there. And as many of those kinds of micro content or other things that you want to be able to embed into a WYSIWYG, it's the same process, but in a modal in the WYSIWYG. So lots of reusability and flexibility for different kinds of page building. And we did not choose, if people are thinking, where's paragraphs in this? We opted not to use paragraphs because paragraphs made some specific interface choices that as we piloted and prototyped a bunch of things and put them in front of our partners at Digital Services Georgia, they were really looking for drag and drop, and Layout Builder was the only way that could really happen the way that they wanted it. So we were again chasing a thing that wasn't actually in a full Drupal release yet, but it became a killer app for us. And again, we've got full nodes and micro content and automatic lists that are all flexibly able to be placed in these kinds of solutions. So we're really happy with the amount of flexibility we can give to an editor, and also the safety with which they can put these pages together without fear that it's going to turn into a zoo in terms of design. So the process that we've had to follow in order to get to all this, the first thing that happened was before Lullabot was ever in the mix, Digital Services Georgia did research, probably more so than any client I've ever worked with. When we got the RFP that started the process for us, we had volumes of personas and like inspection into their Drupal 7 code base and what modules they were using, what content types they had, and patterns of usage from their editors. They did all this kind of stuff so they knew exactly what editor they were serving, what their citizens wanted, and they were super prepared to partner with an agency to build this thing out. Now, that level of research is unusual, but if you're considering a replatform, I would say take a little more time because your agency will thank you. It was such a wonderful thing to be able to propose in detail what we meant to do for them on the basis of the research they've done. So there were tons of spreadsheets, tons of fields, and how many content types in this site and that site, all these kinds of things, and how many instances of events in that particular site versus another site on the platform. But despite the information overload, that really informed our ability to propose and come up with a decent solution. So their initial schedule, they were researching 12 months or more before they expected to launch, and about 9 months prior, they were selecting vendors, which would have been April of 2018. And they intended to start the discovery and the design process in June, so 6 months prior to launch, being probably a December, January launch. And they wanted to be building and testing everything out 3 months before launch, and then launch 6 sites on the platform as their MVP, probably in January of 2019. So that was their initial hope, and that was their plan, and that was what we sort of started with together. And then they were going to keep migrating the other, nearly 100 sites for 12 months more. So you'll see as we go, part of the story is how well did that shake out? Could we hit a January deadline? All those kinds of things. So we were engaged to do content strategy and development, and IDEO, a design firm out of Cambridge, was brought in to do branding and stuff like that. So at the same time as we were doing content strategy, branding was also happening. So we had a big on-site. We all got together. We all talked about just the process and the handoffs between all the different teams. And we started our content strategy process, which is to say that out of the 85 sites, Digital Services Georgia selected about 16 of those for us to do deep content audits with. And so we used a tool called Screaming Frog, which if you're going to do a content audit, Screaming Frog is your tool. It spiders the site. It then lets you use patterns that it might see within the markup that it's scraping off of your site to split the results of the spidering process into separate files so that you can see events and you can see blog posts and you can see landing pages and you can look at all the different stuff and you can look for editorial problems or bad practices or all kinds of other stuff, and it does it from browser in, so as to say it's spidering the site as an HTTP client. We also did work to do this from the database up so that we could look and see where editors had plugged script tags into body fields or other kinds of things like that, because we knew we were going to need that for the migration. But we did 16 site audits. And as well as we were doing Screaming Frog, we also looked at things like reading level and sentiment analysis on this content audit so that we could say, well, you're trying to provide a service to people with an 8th grade reading level, but it's written for a college level. You probably need to adjust your writing style downward to make sure that you're meeting the needs of your users. Sentiment analysis, does this read as friendly or does this read as official? And what's the balance that you want to strike there? And then we provided them with some training about how to do this for the other 80 sites that they were going to have to touch, because we couldn't do all 85 in the time that we had allotted. But we set them on a path to be able to run these audits themselves. And then we started talking about the content that they had and the structure that they had versus the content and the structure that they wanted to have. We picked their brains, talked with various folks within the state outside of Digital Services Georgia, and really talked around how can we make the content structure itself in a citizen-oriented way, in a way that you can get to the services you want, because a citizen, probably in every state, but certainly as we polled the citizens in the state of Georgia, they don't think about an individual agency website. They don't think I'm going to the Department of Revenue. All they see is the state of Georgia. And they don't care that it's dor.georgia.gov or anything else. All they know is they're just trying to pay their taxes or they're just trying to get a business license. So in order to break down the silos that necessarily appear because different state agencies have oversight over different pieces, they came up with a content strategy that would allow them to say, this is how you get a driver's license, or this is how you get a business license, and be able to feature services, how-tos, FAQs, instructional content, and be able to plug all that together in a way that a citizen could go and find their way through that just jungle of stuff and get to the things that they needed, the PDF they need to fill out, the office they needed to visit. So that was a huge piece of conversation, and we were able then to formalize content types which were more intentional for that exact purpose, because that was the whole point of why we're doing this. So what that ended up doing was we took that formal content model, we ran it through with Digital Services Georgia, and then went ahead and for the places where we weren't sure the names were right, like is this called a program or a service? Like when you go to create that in Drupal, what is it going to be called? Like what link do you click? We realized that there were some things that we just couldn't quite decide together what the name should be. And so we went and did surveys and interviews with editors, particularly just to be able to say, what would you call this? And we were probably 60% right collectively between Digital Services and Lullabot about what to call things. But there was easy 40% where the labels had to be adjusted, fields and content type names where we just didn't have our finger quite on the pulse of what the editors wanted. So it's really important to validate the content model with the people that are going to use it before you go and build that thing and then find you're stuck with a naming convention that doesn't really speak to the people that are using it. So what we ended up with is a content model that broke things down into like factual information about agencies, organizations, locations, contacts, as well as other things on the far right, like the editorial content, news and press releases and bios about authors that are writing blog posts and stuff like that. Back over on the left at the bottom, we have visitor aids like instructional content, how-to-Is and FAQs and stuff like that, where it's going to give them discrete steps to follow in order to be sure that you can get that driver's license with one visit to the DMV instead of 4. Oh, I have to bring my what? Oh, that document. And then in the middle, organizational tools. These are like the landing pages, the aggregate pages, listings. And we had to start thinking to ourselves about, this is where the usability comes in. How do editors create a landing page easily? Or how many times does an individual site need to create a listing page? And how do we avoid getting a developer involved in that? Which has led us to some of the solutions I've described. And then also there's media and micro-content, documents, images, videos, that kind of stuff. And so from that, after we'd sort of all gotten an agreement on the general shape of things, we made a massive spreadsheet. And there's probably 20 primary content types and 15 more micro-content types and probably 5 media types, all of which have to have fields. And so we documented that stuff and any behaviors that we expected in talking with DSGA. And this became the Bible for our back-end dev team to build this stuff out. So we had, with that in hand, I could go in tons more detail on this, but Greg Dunlap already did a lot of this in terms of especially the inventory process. So on the Confab website, I stole his picture, but SpeakerDeck has his set of slides from Confab. And you should totally check that out if you're interested in content audits, Screaming Frog, automated looks at your site as a whole and being able to figure out what to do with old and stale content, etc. So our content strategy team sort of handed that big spreadsheet off to us, and we started thinking about migration. So I had a conversation with somebody at the Lullabot table yesterday where they had not used the migrate module before, and so I want to not just slide past that and say the migrate module within Drupal 8 is fantastic. You have config files that are able to say, for this source field and this destination field in the new content model, I want to map them together and I want to apply certain transformations, like I want to strip out script tags or clean up HTML tags or even split content apart, all kinds of things. And then on top of that, because if you have a content model that's very different in one to the other, you can do all kinds of additional customizations, write your own custom transformations, all that kind of stuff. We had a huge amount of complex work to do because the D7 content model was not very much at all like what Drupal 8 has. So we had things like disassembling a single content type into multiple new content, individual nodes. So maybe there was contact information over here. We were able to grab that, pull it out, and stick it in its own home so that we could reuse it later. There was lots of complexity there. We had to be very careful with how we migrated files and images, because instead of just image tags or links to PDF documents sitting in the body of an article someplace, we wanted to bring those files in as media entities in Drupal 8, which meant that you could add fields to them and meta information, and also count usages so that you could see this file is used on these 3 nodes or whatever. And we couldn't do that in Drupal 7. We really wanted to take advantage of that. So we also had to find any link to that file within the body of an article, blog post, or whatever, and not just bring it in as still a link to a file path, but we had to turn it into an entity embed. So you import the file, make it into a thing in Drupal, a media entity, and then go back to where you found it and flip that out from an image tag or an A tag, turn that into an entity embed so that Drupal can grab it and render it. And so now we can have captions because we have a field for captions on images, and that becomes a thing that we can control and theme and add to the design system. So on top of that, Drupal 7 had, because I mentioned this whole like mobile home with the van glued to it, they had paragraphs, they had field collections, they had embeds from Drupal 7, they had all these different things that they had used for various solutions. We had to take each of those and figure out a way to turn a structured set of paragraphs, which we weren't ever going to do again in Drupal 8 in that same way, and turn them into micro content that could be embedded into a WYSIWYG, or turn them into collections of links that could be glued into various places. So there was a lot of apples to oranges transformations that we had to do. And in all of that's because there was a ton of work. Digital Services Georgia has been a fantastic partner at being practical about what are they willing to fix manually in the migration versus what's a code fix. Because there are certain things that are valuable about code fixes. If it's a big problem, if you got hundreds of pieces of content that all suffer from the same symptom, editorial abuse back in the day or whatever, because a lot of times it's sort of like geological eras. You can look at an old content management system and you can see recently we've been doing it with paragraphs, but before that there's this previous era where we did everything in the WYSIWYG a certain way, and then you go another layer deep, and it's just bones everywhere. And so we had to sort of figure out ways to handle all those different kinds of migrations and problems. But some of those are just not big enough to warrant paying a developer to deal with that. And so if it's a small site that only has a few of these kinds of issues, we sort of have developed a fine sense together with DSGA about how to decide that's a manual fix it in Drupal 7 before it migrates, or fix it in Drupal 8 after it migrates, but saving the developer firepower for the stuff that gives you the biggest help. So we did a bunch of work on how we were going to process this stuff. How do you QA 5 sites at a time or 10 sites at a time, because that's how we have to do it. And then we needed to have the right infrastructure to make this all go. So I will now tell you about Tugboat. This is my favorite thing in the world. It saves me time every day, and it's a Lullabot product, so this is a sales pitch, I'm sorry. But it's so good that it's worth it. Tugboat is a cloud-based environment that lets you take any item that your developer is working on and turn it into a working copy of the website at its own private URL. So every issue a developer works on is built and available at its own URL. Used to be when I was a developer, I would have, if I was going to check somebody else's code out, I had to like stop what I was doing. I had to scrub the database clean. I had to start with a fresh copy of their code and debug it and look at it and stuff. Our developers never have to do that because it's happening all on Tugboat. It builds a copy of master with the one change that was being made by your developer. You visit it, you look at it, you also look at the pull request in whatever Git repository tool you're looking at, and you never had to rebuild your site. You just had to go visit a URL and check it out. It also makes early QA for business stakeholders super easy. So if we have the first preliminary idea, we build it, we put it in a pull request, Tugboat stands it up so you can go click around and see how it did. And they can tell us, yep, that's exactly what we want, or they can say, no, fix that. And the environments that these various issues are being checked out on collapse when you hit merge. So they just evaporate and then they're not there anymore. So it looks a little bit, it helps us move quickly, I should say, but it looks a little bit like this. These are all the pull requests on a particular day that we have open. I click on the arrow on the preview button, and I click on that test link because that's our test database. And I want to see how this particular feature performs on that test database. Tugboat says, oh, I'm asleep right now because I'm not trying to use up server resources where they're not needed, but it starts up all its containers for PHP and the database and all that stuff. And then you get a copy of the website. Notice the URL, all that gobbledygook in there. That means it's unique to this particular pull request. And when you're happy with it, it goes and it's gone. So after you merge your code, this disappears. So Tugboat has been massively helpful for years at Lullabot, and we've made it into a product that if you feel like your team needs something like that, either for early QA because you have enough developers working together to peer review each other's work, and you want a fast process for that, Tugboat's a life-changing experience. So I can't say how strongly it's impacted our development process at Lullabot. So IDEO came in as a branding partner, and they did all the things that a branding process typically does. They looked at the personality of the website, all the squishy, touchy-feely stuff about how does color and typography translate to tone and feel. We wanted an official website, but an approachable website. Georgia is all about Southern hospitality, so we talked lots about all these emotional cues that people get from how a font lays on a page or whatever. And they did a great job of interviewing citizens and doing all this stuff and putting it together. An example of that would be, they noted that the state seal of Georgia, which is an official image, has 1 billion variations, and they were used all over the Drupal 7 site in mastheads, like the Attorney General site had the seal right there next to Attorney General of Georgia. And there were all these different versions of that. But you'll note that the elements are 3 pillars, sort of an arch over the top, and a ribbon that goes through, which has some Latin on it, which I don't know actually what it means. But IDEO looked at that and said, that's too much detail in an image to put onto any site ever. And so they came up with the pillars. This is not the state seal. We never want to represent it as that. But it does give you the gestures and the officialness, the pillars and sort of all that iconography that makes you feel like this is an official site and makes it feel like Georgia.gov, but it feels modern. They did that, as well as give us our colors that we started to use eventually for our color palette system, and went through and developed a visual language about what kinds of components would suit the content needs that they had to go and try and serve. But when they stopped in August or September of last year, we didn't have a full design system. We had not applied all of that visual language and personality that they'd created to every content type. And so that's where the traffic happened. That's where we slowed everything down and the project went screech, because we had 20 content types that we needed to apply the visuals to. And DSGA was rightly interested in making sure that the content that we had described for them in that big spreadsheet and that big content model was represented on screen properly, and that any features that needed to support that were properly comped out. And so they gave a ton of scrutiny to making sure that those comps were right. The problem is, they said, 6 months prior, we're going to do discovery and design, and then 3 months prior, maybe September, we're going to be building things, except actually we were just beginning to apply the visual language to the content types and making sure that it all played together well. And then 2 months prior, we were supposed to be, polishing things and finishing up the content model, and we were still applying design to the content strategy. And then a month out, in November, and all this time I'm saying to my counterpart, Donna, who is amazing, hey, I think we're not going to make December or January, because we're still inventing comps left and right. Not just for primary content types, but the dinky little micro content types and promos and stuff. And this was clearly not going to launch in January, and we all knew that. So we had the conversations as early as possible. If you're a project manager or a product owner, this is one of the key skills of a decent project manager, is not being afraid to say, this isn't going to happen, as early as possible. So anybody who has a queasy feeling about the project and is in charge of that kind of thing ought to be screaming real loud as early as possible, because it doesn't get any better when you keep it to yourself. So long experience of burnt fingers will tell you that. These fingers here for me. So we knew that was going to be the case. And this is the thing. There was nothing wrong with the process. It was just taking longer. And we knew that digital services scrutiny was appropriate for the kind of product they wanted to put out there into the world. They knew that they needed to go through and really understand the implications of the content model, which they couldn't do just by looking at a massive spreadsheet. They really had to get the visuals down. And that is, that was an unfortunate reality, because we weren't going to make January. But everybody knew that, and they were more concerned about getting it right than they were about getting it done on the original timeline. And we all could come to agreement on that. So, it was a good time-consuming process. Normally, ideally, you would plan it, you would design it, and then you would add a developer to that mix and you would build it. Except, as Mark mentioned in his talk yesterday, if you design it without development input, you're going to be in trouble, because the designer is going to have a bunch of great ideas, and they are going to be great ideas. I want to honor all the designers in the room as a developer who works with their work product. But they don't always know what's possible. They don't always know what can be done easily, or what helps the budget and the timeline. So instead of planning and then designing and then throwing it over the wall to the developer, you have to plan and then start a long design process with a long build process. And so you have to iterate, and this was very messy. And it was painful for me as a project manager, because I felt like we could never deliver a single piece of finished work to say, hey, Georgia, look, this part is done, because we were always cycling. And it was hard to control for that. So what do you do when you have an extended design phase that you didn't really think was going to take as long as it's taking? It was my job to keep the dev team moving, to figure out, okay, there's high complex, high risk stuff that needs to be talked about, and we can't start on that. Meanwhile, we have to find something for the devs to do, because they've already been plugged into the project. And Lullabot doesn't multi-thread their developers for the most part. So we had a team that was devoted to this, but maybe we couldn't go full bore to build what we expected to build. So we had to figure out how to fill that time, and there was no shortage of things to build, target-rich environment, but we couldn't build the thing we wanted to at the moment that we wanted to build it. So we built what we could. The content model was spec'd out, so we could build out the core content types that weren't really under as much discussion, and then we could focus on data migration as quickly as possible, because that's going to take a long time. So get your data migration moving as quickly as you can, given the constraints of what you've agreed upon with your vendor or with your client. And then you just got to know, if you're going to be designing, iteration and rework are going to happen, and that if that inefficiency is not actually a bad thing, but you just know it's going to take more time or cost more, because every time a designer has ever built a comp in the history of the world, they've included that one little button or that one little thing, that one little like link on the page, and it looks innocuous, but then some developer, annoying developers, they look at that link and they say, well, what does that do? And someone in the meeting says, well, I mean, when you click that, a whole thing happens. And the developer's like, holy moly, a whole thing? Like that, there's a whole feature behind that one little visual element. There's a database, there's a whole custom module, there's something. And inevitably that's gonna be true. So whenever you see a visualization of something like our content model spreadsheet, features creep in. And so you have to control scope and figure out like, what do we actually need in order to get to the finish line, despite all the good ideas? Because the ideas are good, the human creativity is good, but maybe we're not set up to build that on the current timeline. So you got to expect that iteration and rework are going to happen. You got to try and control the scope of the change that the design process brings to you. And then we didn't start all our front-end developers as fast as we had planned because we knew that the design wasn't finished enough. And so we did things like get contractors that we really, really trusted, that we knew were high-quality folks that could work fast, could onboard fast, to be able to work on the designs as soon as they were available, but not be wasting time out of the budget. And again, we couldn't finish one piece of work as quickly or as we would like a sprint for the back end plus the front end in order to deliver a single content type just wasn't possible. But my job was to really fight for that, and it took several months for us to be able to get the front end and the back end teams in sync so that I could say, look, we've made a thing. Look, not only can you create it in the back end, but you can see it rendering in the front end, and it's fully integrated and it looks good. And then the last thing probably to talk about here is that the MVP was too big. 6 sites was a great goal, and we did ship those 6 sites first, but we decided that the spread of features that were needed for those 6 sites was so large that we needed to cut it down. So we had to stop talking about the entire platform and the needs of 100 different sites, agencies, all that stuff. We had to say, like, what's the first site we're going to launch? And this may seem elementary, but it was actually a very difficult thing to be able to get the entire crowd of stakeholders and developers to stop talking about everything and start talking about the one thing that mattered. So what do you really need for the first site? If you've built an entire pattern library with every component that you might ever need, and that's all in Pattern Lab, do you have to build all those things for Drupal for the first site? And the answer is no, you don't. But having that conversation and getting everybody on board to say, all right, what do we actually need? If we don't need this component at 2/3 or 1/3 width, we only need it at full width because the first site only is going to use it at full width. Okay, well we're only going to integrate that particular component for that particular size to start with, so that we can hit the deadline. And those were hard choices. You basically had to isolate that thing you had to ship first, and then stop talking about everything else, which was hard because you go to a grooming meeting and everybody's like, hey, we got all the things that we want to talk about, all these wonderful features and content sharing and things that aren't going to be needed for 6 months. We basically agreed between Donna and I that we would carefully curate the agenda and not let other conversations happen so that we could ship something. And so we left all our darlings alone, and they got dusty and sad on the shelf, but we came back to them and we are fixing them now. And so we iterated on all that stuff, and then we could launch a couple of sites. So we got to a workable version where we had the actual true minimum, which was cutting to the bone and painful because we wanted to ship something as quick as we could. So we shipped our first 2 sites in April, which was approximately 3 months later than we wanted, because sometime in January was our goal. We got to April, and that was about as long as the design conversation took. Surprise! But that was one of those things that was an acceptable change. We just had to juggle when the timelines were going to be. And now, every 3 weeks, we ship a batch of new sites. There's additional features, there's bug fixes, attention to technical debt that we want to clean up. All that stuff is happening. There's an ongoing process of migration QA where we pull the data down from Acquia, we pull the files down, we load them up onto this Tugboat environment in rounds. So like round 5 and 6 are happening right now. And those rounds become available, we QA them, we find any issues that may exist. We decide whether those issues are manual migrations or code-based things that we want to fix within the migration code base. We fix those issues, we QA them all, we ship it out to Acquia, we push the button, the migration comes in, and 3 weeks after that point, the thing goes live, or 2 weeks after that point, the thing goes live after they've made whatever manual changes and created new landing pages and all that kind of stuff. So yesterday we launched 7 sites between 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That's a total of 25 sites since April. We've got 14 more sites that are in process right now for round 5 and round 6, including the largest sites we've yet touched with like 30 gigs of files. You know, some of the big pieces of the platform are coming online now. And right now we're in the planning stage for Georgia.gov, which has some unique features like sharing content from the agencies, like factual stuff like contacts and locations, so that we can have directories at the top level for Georgia.gov to give people access to search for. So the machinery and the automation involved, I haven't talked about very much, except to say that we have definitely had to have automation because you couldn't do all this by hand. When you're migrating 5 or 10 sites at a time. I couldn't have imagined a year ago that we could say, hey, I launched 7 sites yesterday and I didn't break a sweat. But we did not break a sweat, and we all sort of were trying, we kept saying, oh, we better not jinx this as we're launching them. But really the process is such that all we have to do now is flip the load balancer over, make sure that the domain name points to the new application, which is sort of a switch and a clear of the cache, and the sites are up. Because we have an early deployment to prod, early migration to prod, we're just covering the bases because we have to do this. Otherwise, there's no way we could roll at the speed we need to roll. So that process feels normal, but a year ago, I think I probably would have not believed we could do it. So having the time to think through how the infrastructure has to support this kind of a big platform rollout has been a big deal. And one of our Lullabot folks, a guy named James Sansbury, is the key architect for all the ways that we're doing all our automation and continuous integration and all that stuff, automated testing, to make sure that this stuff goes out cleanly. And he is a busy guy, but it's been totally worth it. So that was a lot. Questions? Yes?
Can you drill a little bit into the automation for the migration? Because the template you guys are going at is very fast. It's just migrating legacy work.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know how you actually handle that, and then if you can also speak a little bit to the kind of those editorial managed views and micro content. I'm curious to know a little more about that.
So I'll take the views in the micro content first. I'll say that we decided to make all our micro content as actual nodes, not as other kinds of entities. We've done various permutations of this kind of solution in the past, but basically what it came down to was we wanted to be able to use the regular Drupal contrib ecosystem on our micro content too. And so instead of making a new kind of entity, we made regular content types so that we could do scheduled publishing or whatever other contrib thing to those micro content items, with a couple of customizations where we just said, if this content type has a custom checkbox on it that said this is micro content, that means that you can't visit it if you're not logged in. There's no way to access micro content at its own URL because it's not meant to be freestanding. There's no context for that piece of content outside of the page on which it's placed. So we made all those nodes, which meant that there was a lot less fidgety kinds of stuff to do with the entity system. And then the listing pages stuff, we basically found a way to wrap a view in a node and pass a limited set of configuration stuff that the view would need back to it. So like picking a filter for a taxonomy term for that view, or saying I want a pager, or I want a limited number of records, or I want all the records, those kinds of things, like basic views kinds of configuration. We didn't want to expose all the like stuff that views does to a random editor who's never seen it before. So we just opened up a little bits of that stuff. And we also did stuff like entity browsers that would let you pick certain kinds of content. That's all wrapped in one content type, one node type. And you say, I want an automatic list, or I want a curated list. And then the form uses form states to change things out so that you can build the list you want. But all the editor has to know is, I want to make a list. And once they get there, they're presented with choices about automated lists or whatever, and they can just sort of follow the bouncing ball through the form, and it's very straightforward.
And you use taxonomy to allow people to find it, or how do you?
The lists are, since they're nodes, we put them in the menu system a lot of times, and then from there it gets drilled through to whatever. So if you don't need a landing page, and it's not the kind of view that is super complex, this is a great fit. But there are definitely limits to what the solution will do for you, and then you have to jump over to do a developer build of a custom view. Last thing for you is the the migration runs via address commands, and we have a bunch of automation that says, migrate this site, go. And then it runs all the scripting that we did for that particular migration in the proper order, doing all the all the dependencies for how the migration has to run so that files go before content, so that the files are available to reference when the content is migrated. And we can run and rerun that as often as we need to while we're fixing the code to like test the little bits that we're trying to fix. From there, we wrap that up into our CI and our Tugboat stuff so that it runs the same scripts that we're running on our locals. And it does it for a batch at a time, so 5 sites at a time get migrated. Then we can stand up a Tugboat and go look at it and say, hey, is this right, or are there issues that we need to fix? And so we just cycle that process until we're happy with the migration for a particular round.
And so that involves taking content out of the V7 and putting it in your
Yeah, important thing. We are sanitizing every database so that we don't get any like PII kinds of information coming into our locals. That's just part of our security policy. And from there, we load that in both into our locals, into like a Docker container, and onto Tugboat because they can share that Docker container between the two. So we're working with the same data both places. And then we do file transfers the same way. So that's where our automation comes in, is to get that data from Acquia, get those files from Acquia, and make it available to the local development environments, or make it available to Tugboat for testing and QA and stuff. So other questions? Yes?
You said something early on about publishing a node and a document at the same time.
Yeah.
How are you preventing an uploaded file from being found in a site search before its node is published?
So we can say that the file is not published and therefore not indexable. The media item is not.
Okay, it's because of the new media item.
Every file is going to be a media entity, and
Okay.
it's marked as not published if you don't want it to be.
Got it.
When it's referenced by a node and you push go, it says, hey, we're going to publish this file alongside this node because you referenced it. And we did some other stuff like we made a choice together with Georgia that said we're not going to let files be replaced on media entities at all. So if you put up a file and you want a new version of that file, you make a new media entity. You don't swap the file out from underneath it. And what happens then is you can say this file is now obsolete, replace it with this other one, and it looks for all the references across the system and swaps them. So we had to do some careful work with that in order to make sure that we didn't sort of violate the expectations of a user, and that was a lot of custom stuff, as it turns out. So.
You just answered my question.
Okay, great. Other questions? I think we're pretty much out of time. But. Yes.
You said you have done multiple sites here. So is it a multi-site setup? Or
It is a multi-site setup, single code base.
Okay.
We're using config split to vary certain features out from site to site because some sites don't need everything. And we've written some other stuff that like lets us flip a switch and say migration's on for this site or not on for that site, or search is on or off, those kinds of things. So we have sort of a utility class that helps us do that more easily. So when we provision a site, we can turn on the features we need, including things like permissions. Like there's a very minimal permission scheme, then a higher one that everybody actually uses. And eventually there'll be even more workflow or things like that we add to it, and we can sort of layer that in to turn on certain config splits for certain kinds of sites that need it. Yeah. Other questions? Thanks.